December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns. America reels from the most devastating surprise attack in its history. But what if I told you the attack wasn't really a surprise? What if someone had been watching, listening, gathering intelligence for years? Meet Takeo Yoshikawa, the spy who walked among Americans in plain sight, mapped their entire Pacific fleet, and then vanished into history like smoke. His story begins not with explosions, but with a single calculated decision that would change the course of World War II. And the most terrifying part? Nobody suspected a thing. Takeo Yoshikawa wasn't your typical spy. No secret decoder rings, no midnight rendezvous in dark alleys. In March 1941, he arrived in Honolulu as Tadashi Muramura, a minor Japanese consulate official with a friendly smile and impeccable manners. American counterintelligence officers barely glanced at his file. He seemed harmless, just another diplomat shuffling papers in a backwater posting. But Yoshikawa had trained at the Imperial Japanese Naval's Elite Intelligence Academy. He'd memorized the silhouette of every American warship. And now, standing on Hawaiian soil, he had direct visual access to the U.S. Pacific Fleet's home base. The Fox was inside the henhouse, and the countdown had begun. Every morning, Yoshikawa followed the same routine. He'd rent a small Piper Cub airplane for sightseeing tours over Pearl Harbor. He'd swim in the waters near the naval base, counting ships beneath the waves. He'd sit at waterfront restaurants with binoculars, pretending to be a tourist enjoying the view. Local Americans chatted with him freely. Some even invited him to barbecues. He took no photographs, too risky. He carried no spy equipment, too obvious. Instead, Yoshikawa possessed something far more valuable: a photographic memory and an encyclopedic knowledge of naval operations. Each evening, he'd return to the consulate and encode his observations into messages sent directly to Tokyo. 8 battleships in harbor, carriers absent, torpedo nets not deployed. American intelligence agencies had broken some Japanese codes, but they focused on diplomatic traffic, not these seemingly mundane observation reports. The FBI had Yoshikawa under loose surveillance, but he never met with suspicious contacts or engaged in obvious espionage. He was hiding in plain sight, using the most dangerous weapon in intelligence work: patience. Then, one Sunday morning, everything he had reported would be put to devastating use. December 6, 1941. Yoshikawa made his final reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor. The harbor was packed, exactly as he'd reported. He filed his last intelligence report that evening. Fleet remains in harbor. Conditions favorable. In Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto studied months of Yoshikawa's reports. The spy had provided everything: ship positions, patrol schedules, the depth of the harbor, the absence of torpedo nets, even which days the crews went ashore. The attack plan was already in motion: 6 aircraft carriers sailing in radio silence toward Hawaii. That night, Yoshikawa attended a party at the Japanese consulate. He drank sake and laughed with colleagues, knowing that in hours everything would change. He couldn't tell them, couldn't warn them, couldn't even hint at what was coming. As he stood on the consulate balcony, looking toward the peaceful harbor, he wondered if he'd ever see Japan again. At 7:48 a.m. the next morning, the first bombs fell. Yoshikawa watched from the consulate as Pearl Harbor erupted in flames. His intelligence had been devastatingly accurate. Of the 8 battleships he had identified, all 8 were hit. The Arizona exploded. The Oklahoma capsized. Over 2,400 Americans died in 2 hours. But Yoshikawa's mission wasn't over. Now came the most dangerous part, staying alive in enemy territory as the world's most wanted spy. Within hours of the attack, FBI agents stormed the Japanese consulate. They arrested everyone: diplomats, staff, cleaners. Yoshikawa stood calmly as agents searched his room. They found nothing: no cameras, no codes, no evidence of espionage. His cover as a minor official held firm. Name? Tadashi Muramura, vice consul. The FBI agents were furious but helpless. Under diplomatic protocols, even in wartime, they couldn't torture or execute consulate staff. Yoshikawa was held with other Japanese officials in luxury internment. Comfortable rooms, good food, relative freedom. He played cards and chatted amiably with his captors, never breaking character. American counterintelligence scrambled to understand how Japan had known exactly where to strike. They interrogated every Japanese national in Hawaii. They broke more codes. They analyzed attack patterns. The spy had to be someone with direct access, someone who'd been watching for months. Yoshikawa sat in his comfortable cell and said nothing. He'd destroyed all evidence before the attack. His reports had been encoded and sent through regular diplomatic traffic. He'd used no accomplices who could betray him. And crucially, the Americans didn't even know Tadashi Muramura was a false identity. In June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, a prisoner exchange was arranged. Yoshikawa boarded a neutral ship with other Japanese diplomats. As the vessel left Honolulu Harbor, now bustling with warships preparing for the Pacific campaign, he finally allowed himself a small smile. But his story takes an even stranger turn on the voyage home. The ship carrying Yoshikawa stopped in neutral Mozambique for refueling. There, in a dusty port bar, he encountered an American journalist who had also been expelled from Japan. They struck up a conversation, two enemies sharing drinks on neutral ground. The journalist complained about Japanese secrecy. Yoshikawa, perhaps feeling the weight of his secret, came dangerously close to revealing everything. "You Americans," he said carefully, "you see, but you don't observe." The journalist raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Yoshikawa smiled enigmatically and changed the subject. That moment, that brief crack in his composure, would be the closest anyone came to the truth for decades. When Yoshikawa finally reached Japan in August 1942, he expected a hero's welcome. Medals, promotions, recognition as the spy who made Pearl Harbor possible. Instead, he received a strange, muted response from his superiors. "You did excellent work," his commander told him. "We cannot publicly acknowledge it." Why? Because Japan was still trying to maintain that Pearl Harbor was a legitimate military surprise attack, not the result of espionage. Admitting they had a spy in Hawaii would undermine their claims and potentially violate international laws regarding diplomatic espionage. His success had to remain a secret, even from most of the Japanese military. He was reassigned to a desk job, given a modest payment, told to never speak of his mission. For a man who'd single-handedly provided the intelligence for history's most consequential surprise attack, it felt like betrayal. But worse was coming, much worse. As the Pacific War turned against Japan, Yoshikawa watched helplessly from the sidelines. The intelligence networks he had helped build were dismantled. The navy he had served was destroyed ship by ship. And in August 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. American occupation forces arrived, and suddenly Yoshikawa faced a terrifying dilemma. When the Americans cross-referenced Japanese military records, would they discover that Tadashi Muramura and intelligence officer Takeo Yoshikawa were the same person? If they did, he'd face war crimes trials. Execution was certain. He went underground, destroyed his military identification, burned his uniforms, took on yet another false name, his third identity in 4 years. He moved to a rural village and took work as a factory laborer, hiding among thousands of displaced people in post-war chaos. For 3 years, he lived in fear. Every knock on the door might be American MPs. Every stranger could be an informant. He grew thin, started drinking. The man who'd possessed nerves of steel while spying in Hawaii was crumbling under the weight of his secret. Then in 1948, something remarkable happened. A Japanese journalist who'd been investigating Pearl Harbor intelligence discovered evidence of Yoshikawa's mission. Rather than expose him to American authorities, the journalist approached Yoshikawa directly. "Your country should know what you did," the journalist said. "The war is over. You deserve recognition." Yoshikawa stared at him. Recognition meant exposure. Exposure meant the Americans would know, and the Americans would want justice. What happened next would determine whether history remembered him as a hero or a war criminal. In 1953, 8 years after the war's end, a small Japanese magazine published an anonymous article. "I was the Pearl Harbor spy." The piece contained details only the real spy could know: ship positions, surveillance techniques, the exact timeline of his reports. American intelligence agencies went into overdrive trying to identify the author. But by then, Yoshikawa had disappeared again. The article gave no real name, no location, no photograph. It was a ghost's confession, tantalizing, detailed, and utterly untraceable. U.S. investigators interviewed hundreds of former Japanese consulate employees. They cross-referenced every Tadashi Muramura in Japanese records. They offered rewards for information. They found nothing. Yoshikawa had perfected the art of vanishing. Meanwhile, in a tiny apartment in Osaka, Yoshikawa read about the American hunt for him with grim satisfaction. He'd outlasted them. The statute of limitations on espionage was murky, but practically, a decade after the war, prosecuting a foreign spy for pre-war intelligence gathering would be politically complicated. More importantly, he'd become a ghost story, a legend without a face. But isolation was its own prison. Yoshikawa had no friends who knew his real history, no family he could confide in. The magnitude of what he'd done, enabling an attack that killed thousands, haunted his drinking sessions. Some nights, he'd stare at old photographs of Pearl Harbor and wonder if those American sailors who'd waved at him from their ships knew they had weeks to live. In 1960, a stunning development forced him out of hiding. A former Imperial Navy admiral published his memoirs, and in them he casually mentioned intelligence officer Yoshikawa's excellent pre-war work in Hawaii. The name was out. American newspapers picked up the story. "Pearl Harbor spy identified," screamed headlines across the Pacific. Yoshikawa could run again, or he could do something radical. Tell his story on his own terms. He contacted a Japanese publisher and agreed to a tell-all book, but only if published exclusively in Japan, only in Japan, and only without any photographs of his current appearance. The publisher agreed. In 1961, "I Was Defeated at Pearl Harbor" hit Japanese bookstores. It was part confession, part justification, part bitter reflection on a war that had cost Japan everything. American intelligence agencies obtained copies and had them frantically translated. Finally, they had their man, except they still didn't know what he looked like now or where exactly he was. The book revealed his wartime identity, but carefully obscured his current life. The CIA station in Tokyo launched a manhunt.
They staked out the publisher's office. They tried to trace royalty payments. They interviewed anyone mentioned in the book. But Yoshikawa, even while publicly confessing, remained a phantom. He'd written the book through intermediaries, received payments through shell accounts, and never once appeared in person. Then came an offer that would force the ultimate decision. In 1964, an American film studio proposed a massive movie about Pearl Harbor and wanted to hire Yoshikawa as a consultant. The fee was substantial enough to secure his retirement. There was one condition. He'd have to come to Hollywood for filming. Set foot on American soil. Return to the scene of his greatest triumph and America's greatest tragedy. Face, perhaps, arrest or assassination. The studio assured him he'd have legal protection, but could he trust them? Could he trust that some Pearl Harbor survivor wouldn't recognize him and take justice into their own hands? For weeks, Yoshikawa wrestled with the decision. The money was tempting, the recognition even more so. But the risk was astronomical. American public opinion still burned hot about Pearl Harbor. Remember Pearl Harbor remained a rallying cry. Was he willing to bet his life on legal protections? In the end, he declined. But he agreed to something almost as dangerous: a filmed interview on Japanese soil, which would be shown in America. In 1965, at age 58, Takeo Yoshikawa appeared on camera for the first time since 1941. His face, older, weathered, haunted, was broadcast to millions of Americans who'd spent 24 years wondering what the Pearl Harbor spy looked like. The response was explosive. Veterans groups called for his extradition. Others argued he'd simply done his job as a soldier. The Japanese government, caught in the middle, quietly assured the U.S. that Yoshikawa had broken no post-war laws and would not be surrendered. But something strange happened as Americans watched the interview. Yoshikawa didn't gloat. He didn't justify Japanese militarism. Instead, he spoke with deep sadness about the war, about the sailors he'd watched die, about the destruction his intelligence enabled. He expressed something that sounded very much like remorse. "I was a soldier following orders," he said quietly. "But that doesn't erase the faces I saw in Pearl Harbor, the men who died because of information I provided. I dream about them sometimes." Some Americans found this humanizing. Others found it infuriating. What right did he have to remorse after enabling mass murder? The debate raged across editorial pages, but legally, nothing could touch him. He was a foreign intelligence officer who'd operated before the war officially began. Morally complicated? Absolutely. Legally prosecutable? No. Yoshikawa lived the rest of his life in quiet obscurity in Japan. He gave occasional interviews to historians studying Pearl Harbor intelligence. Always careful, always measured. He became a consultant on espionage techniques for Japanese security services, training a new generation of intelligence officers. In his later years, he'd sometimes visit Yasukuni Shrine, where Japan's war dead are honored. He'd stand before the memorial and wonder if those who died because of his intelligence, American and Japanese alike, would forgive him. He'd done his duty to his country. He'd been exceptionally good at his job. But the cost was measured in thousands of lives. In 1993, at age 86, Yoshikawa attended a Pearl Harbor Survivors Conference in Japan. Some survivors had traveled to meet the man who'd enabled the attack that changed their lives forever. The meetings were tense, emotional, and ultimately surprisingly civil. These were old men now, former enemies confronting history. One survivor asked him, "Do you have regrets?" Yoshikawa paused for a long time. "I have something more complicated than regrets," he finally said. "I have understanding. I understand now what I couldn't then, that we were all caught in something larger than ourselves. But one mystery remained that he never fully explained.
During the 1993 conference, a historian asked Yoshikawa a question that had puzzled analysts for decades. How did you evade FBI surveillance so completely? They were watching you, yet you gathered intelligence freely. Yoshikawa smiled, that same enigmatic smile he'd given the journalist in 1942. Because I understood something fundamental about human psychology, he said. People see what they expect to see. The FBI expected spies to act like spies, meeting in dark alleys, taking photographs, being secretive. I acted like a friendly, somewhat lazy diplomat who liked sightseeing. I hid by being exactly what I appeared to be, except with different intentions. He paused, then added something chilling. And because I had help that nobody suspected. The room went silent. Help? After 52 years of maintaining that he'd worked completely alone, was Yoshikawa suggesting there'd been accomplices? I've said too much, he concluded, and refused to elaborate further. That tantalizing hint became his final mystery. Historians have debated it ever since. Did Yoshikawa have unknown accomplices in Hawaii? Were there other spies, perhaps American traitors or sympathizers who helped him? Or was this just an old spy's final bit of mischief, planting a mystery that would outlive him? Various theories emerged. Perhaps a Japanese-American provided him with information. Maybe a corrupt naval officer sold him intelligence. Or possibly he simply meant the unwitting help of talkative Americans who never realized they were talking to a spy. Yoshikawa died in 1993, just months after the conference, at age 86. He took the answer to his grave. His funeral was small, quiet, attended mostly by family and a few former intelligence colleagues. No American officials came, no Pearl Harbor survivors, no ceremonies or honors. He was buried under a simple stone that read simply his name, not Moremura, not any of his cover identities, but Takeo Yoshikawa and his dates. But his legacy is anything but simple. Yoshikawa proved that the most effective espionage doesn't require high technology or elaborate schemes. It requires patience, observation, and the ability to blend in so completely that you become invisible. Intelligence agencies worldwide still study his techniques. His approach to human intelligence gathering, minimalist, patient, and psychologically sophisticated, remains a model for spycraft. Yet questions linger. Did he really work alone? What happened to his reports during those 6 months between his return to Japan and his desk job assignment? Were there parts of his story he never told? And most hauntingly, if one man with binoculars and a good memory could enable such devastation, what might today's spies with satellite imagery, digital surveillance, and quantum computing be capable of? The FBI's post-war analysis of Yoshikawa's operation concluded with a disturbing assessment. Subject operated for 8 months under our surveillance, and we detected nothing. Our failure was not in resources, but in imagination. We couldn't imagine someone could spy so simply, so openly. This must never happen again.
But it did happen again, and it continues to happen, because Yoshikawa understood a fundamental truth about security. The biggest vulnerabilities aren't in systems, but in human psychology. In our tendency to see what we expect to see, to trust friendly faces, to assume that danger looks dangerous. The man who infiltrated America and disappeared forever ultimately never truly disappeared. He's there, in every counterintelligence training manual, every lesson about complacency, every warning about underestimating the enemy. His ghost walks through every security checkpoint, asking the same question he silently asked those FBI agents in 1941. Are you really watching, or are you just looking? And somewhere, perhaps, he is smiling that enigmatic smile, knowing that even in death, he remains the spy who got away with it.